A very good morning to everyone, and thank you for coming to this talk. First, I would like to start by thanking the Regional Studies Association for the wonderful opportunity to have this stage and a platform to speak about an ongoing research project that hopefully resonates with some themes that have already been foregrounded earlier in this conference. So in some ways it's very timely, but without the support of the RSA, we wouldn't have this opportunity. So thank you so much, and thank you for the committee for this award and this opportunity. Hopefully I won't disappoint, and we could have a platform for further conversation after this presentation. Right, so let's get started. Today my talk is on infrastructure, strategic coupling, and the politics of regional development. So if you unpack these terms individually, they are not novel. All right, we talk about infrastructure, we talk about strategic coupling, and we talk about regional development. I mean, they are not really things that are, concepts or notions that are new to us, right? But I would like to pull them together and in a form of a relationship, and hopefully this opens up the floor for questions. So, infrastructure has been a long-standing aspect of development. And I think a few sessions in this conference have talked explicitly about the role of infrastructure in driving development, and particularly financialization. Right. Broadly speaking, at both policy making and academic levels, infrastructure is back in the spotlight. So people are beginning to talk once again more about infrastructure, and this is the primary motivation for work that I have commenced, and now it's a joint collaboration. So the topic of infrastructure is now once again gaining attention, and this is the broad backdrop for the presentation. Right, it's back in the spotlight. People are talking about it. It's an engine of growth. So what do we make of the role of infrastructure in regional development? And to give some examples, infrastructure is big at a variety of scales and in the ways that they have been expressed. So within the UK, and this could be familiar to quite a number of us, right? HS2 is a major project that has been planned. It's on off. It's still ongoing. The full rollout of the plan is still not fully certain. Some routes may be pulled. Some routes will go ahead, and that was previously HS1, but it is a major project that is deemed to be a new engine of growth for the UK economy. Right, so that's here in the UK within the national scale. And if we move to Southeast Asia, transnational scale, we look at the establishment of LNG, liquefied natural gas, bunkers and storage capacities, and we see a different picture if we look at what infrastructure is now being planned for development. So if you look at LNG in Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, right, it's big, and it's big business. And again, this is not really at the forefront of debates, but infrastructure development in this aspect is major, and it's I think from this map, we can see that there are a lot of planned projects that are going on. So these are, again, an example of the role and importance of infrastructure. Then we move to North America, all right? And for those who follow the debates about the oil pipelines and whether the new pipelines should be built, there's a major debate in Canada as well. Should more pipelines be built in order to enhance the transport of fuel? Right, so already there's a very established system, but it's deemed to be not enough to support future growth. So oil needs to be transported in a quicker way, right, to the coast so that it can be transported elsewhere. And broadly speaking, to facilitate the expansion of capital accumulation. Right, so the lines that are dotted here indicate those that are proposed. All right, so in North America itself, even though oil transport is the oil pipelines are considered to be relatively advanced and developed, right? There are more plans to expand this. And that's North America, all right? The scale is big, but that's an even bigger scale now when we take into account China's role and China's ambition to establish a Belt and Road project that encompasses multiple continents, all right, from China to Europe and to Africa, both sea and land routes, and the establishment of infrastructure to support the flow of people, goods, and raw materials, all right, along both land routes and sea routes. And I'll expand on these subsequently with a reference to an ongoing project that we're doing in Newcastle that focuses on the EU-China transcontinental railway. But let's get down to some basics. Now, what is infrastructure? Right. I mean, this term is familiar to a lot of us, but how do we define it? I mean, when we talk about infrastructure in relation to development. So, infrastructure, broadly in the literature, I think we can break them down into three particular aspects. First, it is a facilitative channel, right? So pipes are meant to transfer water, petrol, liquids, whatever it is, from one point to another. So it facilitates the flow of things, right? Infrastructure. You can define that as such. You can also define infrastructure as a biopolitical project, all right? It is not just to transport stuff, but it is also a project to enhance our lives on the one hand, all right, to improve our well-being on the one hand, but at the same time, it is also to subject our lives to control and to discipline. All right, so it's a biopolitical project. All right, that's another definition and a way to look at infrastructure. And finally, infrastructure can act as a futuristic symbol, just like this image here. By the way, this is a reality. Could we make a guess how many people came from this airport to London? Hundreds. Yeah, so this is a new airport in Beijing that has recently just opened, and the Chinese government invested $12 billion to build this airport. So when it was conceived, it was a futuristic symbol of China's development, but now it is reality. All right, but a lot of countries, a lot of policymakers believe in the power of infrastructure to drive various forms of ideological nationalistic projects. So infrastructure can act as a futuristic symbol. So when we pull all these together, we look at infrastructure and think about its ontology. So what do we really mean about infrastructure when we think about it as a facilitative channel, when we think about it as a biopolitical project, and when we think about it as a symbol? All right. We think about ontology, and actually, it is quite peculiar, as Brian Larkin tells us. All right. Brian Larkin has a very well-cited paper on the enchantment of infrastructure, whereby he reflects philosophically about the role of infrastructure, which I find very helpful to set this conceptual stage for today's talk. And that is, infrastructure are things. Just like this tap, it's a thing, you can touch it, all right, you can turn it. Of course, water must flow out, but they are also the relation between things. All right, so water will flow from one point to another, and so it is an enabler, but it is also a thing in itself. Right, so infrastructure represents things, the physical aspects of it. They also are relations, so they enable something to happen. And today, with this as the background, I would like to ask this question in this talk, and that is, what is the relation between infrastructural provision and regional development? So we are looking at infrastructure, not just at a project specifically, not just as a thing, but at the relationship that infrastructure builds with regional development. If we look at the literature and if we look at policy documents and in the media, I think it is clear that there's a renewed emphasis on infrastructure-led development, especially after the 2008 financial crisis. So there have been varying interpretations on why there is a renewed focus on infrastructure. So in the developed world, all right, generally neoliberalism is identified as a culprit because states roll back provision of infrastructure. Therefore, there's a lack of adequate infrastructure to sustain life, broadly speaking, hence the need to invest in more infrastructure. Whereas in the developing world, lack of finance, right, lack of proper financing channels and persistent uneven development has been identified as the reasons. Right, but before we get down to all these reasons, generally, whether it's in the developed world or whether it's in the developing countries, there has been a renewed emphasis in infrastructure-led development. So it is identified as a new source of growth. And with taking these into account, Seth Schindler and Michael Kanai, in a very recent paper in Regional Studies, identified this phenomenon and noted that there is this push to develop transnational connections through infrastructural projects. And I think they have a very powerful metaphor and powerful expression that I would draw on in this talk. And they claim the aim of contemporary spatial plans is to get the territory right. So you need to get it right? Through internationally coordinated investments in network infrastructures and, more importantly, to produce territories that can be plugged in to competitive global networks of production and trade. And as we speak, they're actually organizing a workshop in Manchester now to develop this project and these ideas, right? The main thing for me that is very interesting is there is this notion that we need to get the territory right. And this is very relevant, and of course, we see why it's published in Regional Studies. It's very relevant for regional governance. Right, get the territory right, so to speak, and development will follow. But let's ask this question, and I think this could be an add-on and an extension to their wonderful paper. And that is, when does a territory become right? So how do you know that it's right? When you are trying to develop an infrastructural project, how do you know, or how do policymakers know, that this is supposed to be right? Do you know beforehand that it will be right, or is it an intrinsically speculative endeavor? Well, this is the question I asked myself when I read the paper. Yes, there is this push amongst planning, planners, in spatial planning, to get the territories right. Yes, the impetus for growth is there, but when does it become right? This, for me, is an empirical question that needs further investigation. And so to do this, I did what all responsible scholars would do. I went in, then looked at a range of literature. And broadly speaking, there are three fields. First, in social anthropology, in anthropology, sociology, there is a focus on the promise of infrastructure, primarily infrastructure as a representation of something to be looked forward to. So infrastructure has a particular promise. All right, so this literature is, it gives us an idea about the rationale of why people sought, the planners try to get territories right by coming up with huge or symbolic or ambitious infrastructural projects. So, as symbolized by the title, the promise of infrastructure. So infrastructure promises something, and as a result, we are doing it. Then there is the more technical literature that tells you how to get it right. All right, so infrastructure as an asset class. All right, so you must identify certain and portion and categorize certain infrastructure as assets and try to generate money out of it. All right, so the how-to aspect. So in finance, there are a lot of books, all right, that focuses on infrastructure today. But for us, and I think the most relevant from a regional development perspective and from the broader perspective of regional studies, this book by Andy Park and colleagues, right, on financializing city statecraft and infrastructure, provides the closest understanding on the importance of infrastructure in development and how it is being done on the ground, so to speak. So this is the one of, if not the major publication that has dealt specifically with how city statecraft, which is local governments, have become financialized, all right, and therefore act as financial actors according to the logics of finance and get involved directly with infrastructural provision and development. So with the help of this literature, I would like to take a step back and try to think about how do we understand the relationship between the supply of infrastructure and actualizing infrastructure, as in determining whether it is right. And I have a hypothesis. I mean, I'm sure there will be some disagreements with this, but I have a hypothesis and a proposal. And here it is. I argue that the ability of local or regional institutions to utilize infrastructural facilities through attracting and embedding lead firms, major firms, and the respective production networks, right? If they are able to do this, it represents a tangible moment of getting the territory right. So, it's not sufficient if you just build an airport. It's not sufficient if you just build an industrial park and build all the roads around the industrial parks and supply all the subway networks if no firm is investing in the industrial park. So for me, this hypothesis is you need to, local regional institutions would have to embed firms and embed their respective production networks, and by extension, the labor force that supports these production networks in order to utilize the infrastructure that has been built. So it's only when utilization is confirmed that you can ascertain that the territory has become right. Right. And to do this, we ask the question, how is effective demand? As in, effective demand is not just notional demand, I desire to buy something, that is, rather, you have the capacity to buy something, and so how do regions generate effective demand? We go back to a concept that is very familiar to most of us here, and that's strategic coupling. Developed is a mature concept developed in the global production networks literature, right? And it looks at how local and regional institutions engage in intentional action and active deliberation about development. It's time and space contingent, so it focuses on a particular place, and more specifically, as I will elaborate a little, it focuses on the region. And it transcends territorial boundaries. And what this means is, when regions engage, and when regional institutions engage in strategic coupling, they do not just look at engaging actors within the regions, they engage regions, institutions and actors at a variety of scales. Right, so broadly, this is how this concept is summarized. And the reason why this is helpful, and we go back to the literature that is about 10 years old now, is if we focus on strategic coupling, it foregrounds the subnational scale as the primary analytical scale. So it brings us to the subnational region, whether it's the township, whether it is the province, or whether it is the city. All right, but it focuses attention on local and regional institutions and what they do to engage a variety of actors in order to stimulate the investment that then make them get the territory right. But as I was looking at this concept, as I was working through this, right, I found that it's a little prescriptive. So there are 3 main points, so we just need to actualize and look at these 3 main points, then maybe we can find something else. But as I was thinking about it, in engaging and using strategic coupling to understand how infrastructural projects are proposed and subsequently implemented, right, it actually raises this question. So if strategic coupling is so promising, all local governments should be doing it. But when they do it, right, they would inevitably engage in competition. Would they not compete for what is actually a very finite pie? Right? Demand is finite. Demand is not like, unending and indefinite, right? So they will be competing. So how do we incorporate this notion of competitiveness and into our understanding of how infrastructural projects are implemented? So let's go back to the image earlier of the mega airport that was built in Beijing, right? So what kinds of competitions were launched between the Beijing government and the rest of China? Nobody knows, right? Because maybe it's not investigated, it's not of interest yet, but we know that it is actualized, right? But what are the competitive dynamics that underpin the construction of this is not clear. So I find the issue being the existing conceptualization of strategic coupling downplays inter-regional competitive dynamics. And we need to pay more attention, not just to what is being done by local institutions, but we need to understand how they have competed with competitors when they try to actualize their particular projects. So this leads on to a more specific empirical investigation, a more specific question, and that is how does inter-regional politics underpin strategic coupling for infrastructure-led development? And I think a focus on politics, a focus on the competition between actors for limited resources, for limited market share, right, would give us an insight into the strategic coupling, an additional insight into the strategic coupling process, and give us a better understanding of how local and regional institutions are trying to get their territories right. So let's go very briefly. I'm not going to spend too much time on the case study, but I'd like to just use this case to elaborate on how these concepts have been utilized in our ongoing project. I've actually, due to my enthusiasm, I've actually signed up for one more session this afternoon to elaborate on this. So I have a case study, so if you'd like to hear more about the juicy aspects, in the afternoon, please. But at the moment, right, we have been trying to look at the construction of the European Union China Transcontinental Railway, and that has been an ongoing project for about 7 or 8 years now. So for those who have not been introduced to this this project, all right, it started off in central China, but now is incorporated in this Belt and Road mega infrastructural development project that is at once also a futuristic symbol. So this is the case that we are working with under this broad banner of One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative. So if you look back at the literature that has been introduced earlier, right, this Belt and Road Initiative, all right, it has aspirational visions of an interconnected world, all right, through infrastructural investments. Okay, so this is the broadly reported information that we have in the media, right? But it has aspirational visions, and they correspond to the field of literature that we saw earlier that talks about the promise of infrastructure. It also shapes the flow of people, raw materials, and goods in multiple nation states. All right, for better or worse, it's hotly debated now. All right, some people claim that this initiative has caused a lot of debt trap. It's part of the debt trap diplomacy. But some people claim it's great because, like parts of Nepal, for instance, would not have received the kind of investments that it's receiving now. All right, but whatever it is, it's shaping flows of people, raw materials, and goods in multiple nation states. So it has a direct impact on people's lives. All right, biopolitics. Then the broader question is, how does this get funded, financed, and managed at the city regional scale? Well, we have insights at the moment from city regional statecraft, which is excellent, but how do we understand this from the perspective of the One Belt, One Road project and from how this is done from within China? All right, so this is the question that guides, these are the questions that guide the project. And now let's look at the rail connections. All right, this is a slightly dated map. All right, things happen very quickly in China. All right, but when it started in 2011 and 2012, all right, in this central Chinese city of Chongqing, all right, it is purely strategic coupling on the part of the Chongqing government, which is the local government of this city, all right, to connect Hewlett-Packard to the European Union. So the Chongqing government was trying its best to encourage Hewlett-Packard to move all its production networks from coastal China into central China. So it decided to launch this railway to transport all the notebooks from central China to the European Union in under 3 weeks. So from my understanding today, it is now possible to do it in 12 days. So from central China to the European Union in 12 days. But this is the background. Chongqing was relatively successful in doing this. I mean, it was subsidized by the state, but it was one of the broader initiatives to try to get global production networks to move. Right? So there was this railway that was built. But local governments in China, having seen Chongqing's relative success in doing this, all decided, and this is not deliberate use of the metaphor, decided to jump on the bandwagon. So they've decided to compete. And very quickly, all right, today, as we speak, there are more than 60 cities in China competing for routes directly to the European Union. And a few cities have run ahead of the queue, and our investigation is looking at 5 cities, right? But there's a case study this afternoon of another city here in Zhengzhou in Henan province. All right, so it is trying very hard to outcompete Chongqing and trying to do a whole range of activities in order to capture freight volume, often using state subsidies and using a variety of means to try to encourage firms, sometimes at a loss, to transport goods from elsewhere in China to Zhengzhou and then transport them to the European Union. Right. But what is being shown here is local governments in China are actively engaging in acts of strategic coupling. They try to create effective demand, all right, for freight that can leave their respective cities and establish connections with the European Union. So the policies vary by cities, and we are currently investigating how Chongqing, Chengdu, Zhengzhou, and 2 more cities that one particular city has now run to the forefront of it is Xi'an and Wuhan. So all in central China, all trying their best to run ahead of the queue and be a top logistical center. So building on this infrastructural-led development, right? And as a result, the originator of this route is now having to respond. So Chongqing is, in response to this, is trying out new programs and new offerings, all right, in order to continue to get a decent market share, right? So with this case study, we aim to show that there are specific politics to this regional development. And one finding that I would like to share, this might be very interesting, is all these cities, when they started, they received subsidies from the central government, right? In fact, they still do receive subsidies. But after achieving some degree of success, right, one very senior person who was directly involved in the implementation of this project in one of the cities told us, I would like to now ask the central government of China to stop giving subsidies to our competitors so that the field will be leveled, so that their natural disadvantage will be shown. And because we have established this advantage, so we should be allowed to continue to capture market share, and those that are currently not very efficient should not receive any subsidies. But this obviously is a very contradictory comment, because everyone used some degree of subsidies in order to start this project. So there are a lot of competitive dynamics that could be unearthed, and they're quite interesting in order to understand how respective regions are trying to get the territories right where infrastructure is concerned. And with this, we come to the concluding remarks of today's presentation, and that is, to understand whether infrastructural territories are right, the ability to engage in strategic coupling is crucial. right? That's one takeaway that I would like to present to everyone. But the coupling process is filled with tensions, and one of which is the competition with other regions. So we need to understand how regions compete in order to understand how things work on the ground, right? They do not just implement a process which is insulated from competitive dynamics. Therefore, strategic coupling represents the temporary resolution of these tensions, right? We understand how the politics are played out, and eventually some firms or some cities run ahead and they are successful at a particular time, right, at a specific historical conjuncture. Right, it's a temporary resolution of these tensions when strategic coupling finally takes place. Right, it is only temporary because if we go back to the older debate on urban entrepreneurialism, all right, if every city tries to do and mimic the same program of development, all right, any kind of success will only be temporary until the next competitor comes along. Thank you.